Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Debatable with your hosts, Nina and Kyle. I'm Kyle.
I'm Nina.
And this is a post-debate analysis for our science and medicine round for Debatable InterVarsity. Our motion contributor for this team is Dr. RJ Lim. RJ is one of those people who need no introduction in the debate community. They've been coaching Southridge for years and debating for even longer than that. They're also a medical professional. They also helped me when I ad-scored Ateneo InterVarsity. There was someone with chickenpox, so they helped contain it. So we're so happy to have you here, RJ. Hello.
Hello, hi. Hello,
So-
hello everyone.
Hello. So the motion is about prioritizing the funding of scientific research conducted by members of historically marginalized groups. The first question we ask all of our motion contributors is whether or not something inspired this motion. Is there like a particular event or a piece of matter that inspired this motion?
Actually for me, I just noticed kasi that research motions aren't very common in tournaments. Actually, science and health motions outside of directly COVID-related motions haven't like really gone up in popularity since the start of online debate. And, you know, as a doctor, and even before I became a doctor, I was always very fascinated with debating science motions. And since my undergraduate course before I became a doctor was BS Public Health, so research is quite near and dear to my heart. So I when I was asked to contribute a motion, I dug deep into like my experiences, and I realized that I would want to introduce or to give a research motion. Yeah.
What do you think is the importance of science motions, even outside of the COVID context? So you did mention that recently, because of online debating, med motions have been coming up, but they're mostly just COVID related. So what's the importance of looking outside of COVID and having medical motions in general?
Yeah, so I think actually medical motions and specifically like research motions in general are actually very rich. Like the subject matter might not always be accessible to everyone, but I think talking about like the history of science, which has evolved quite significantly over time, and the way that we have conducted research, who we prioritize, what we research on, and most importantly, who benefits from the research that we conduct is a very interesting field and a very interesting point of discussion that I don't think gets talked about a lot like in debate. So I think like these types of motions are things that people should get more exposed to. Yeah.
So the motion talks about prioritization of funding. So how would you define prioritization? Like what does prioritizing of funding even look like?
Yeah, so just I guess a brief background there. So currently, the way that research is funded, it's actually funded mostly through grants.
Public grants are given by the state. So what factors does the state actually look at when determining who gets that grant to begin with?
How likely is it that your research can get done in the period of time that they need results? The cost of the research and the potential impact of the research. So how many people do they feel like it can affect? And if you're being sponsored by like a private corporation, obviously they would rather sponsor research that potentially benefits them. So that's how it normally works. The reason for this motion specifically being set to talk about prioritizing historically marginalized groups is because if you look at the history of the way that scientific research has been funded and who gets to lead this research, it has disproportionately prioritized white men actually to be what we call primary investigator, meaning when you read the scientific paper, they are the first name that is credited, and usually they are the ones who present the research and are credited for being the like masterminds of the research. Yeah. So in this specific motion, the way I would set up funding is that aside from what I already mentioned about how we decide how to fund or who gets funded, we would add an additional qualifier of you would have to be a member of a historically marginalized group as the primary investigator. So this could be women, gender minorities, or people of color, and you would get the priority over research that would be led by like cis white men basically, or etc.
So what frame would you use on government to enter into the round?
Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, the most important way to frame this debate in Gov is to talk about the historically poor representation of these historically marginalized groups, such as women, LGBT, and people of color in research. So there's a few ways that you could frame this. So the first one is to talk about how historically there have been very few women and POCs that have been allowed into STEM fields. Obviously, it's gotten better in the recent past, but if you look at, for example, the number of like Nobel Prizes, for example, that have been awarded to non-white men, for example, only 25 women have been awarded the Nobel Prize in medicine, chemistry, physics, and economics combined since the start of the Nobel Prize, compared to the rest of them being men. So that's one.
So that makes sense. Historically, many of these sciences are built predominantly by white men, so I get that. Except, I suppose, for exceptional cases like Marie Curie. I mean, that's why they're called exceptional cases, I suppose. But I also think that there's barely any input from people of color, or if there are like pieces of input, we just forget about them. Like so much research from the Middle East, we just straight up forgot about them. So with that said, what would the second frame be for Gov?
The second frame that I would also use is that because there were fewer opportunities for people of color and women to access STEM fields, they were also not just less likely to be placed in positions where they could access funding and generate research ideas, but the agenda setting power of the people who were in that position meant that issues that surrounded, women, gender minorities, and people of color took a backseat to like more general issues that they felt were more important, but really only affected the dominant majority or dominant majority groups. So I think that's like a very important, or those are the two really important frames with regards to like the historical analysis of why these marginalized groups have been left out.
So given all those things, what would be really good arguments for government to run, especially if you're like on opening? How would you run this on government?
Okay, so if I was the opening half, the way that I would do it is, the first thing is to talk about this as a way of correcting that historical injustice. So it's not really a form of reparations, but more of a way of being more inclusive and recognizing that these marginalized groups have not just been disprivileged in general, like by the state, for example, but more specifically by the field of science, right? So you would have to talk about the opportunities that are being denied people who are equally competent and who are able to conduct these types of research. And the reason that they aren't able to, for example, contribute as much to the field is because they are denied opportunities through this funding. Because if your research doesn't get funded, you won't really be able to do anything. It's very hard to self-fund a research because it's so expensive. It requires a lot of tools that you might not even get access to in order to analyze data. I would also talk about how, since the academe has a publish or perish mentality, for example, it becomes even more difficult to ascend in terms of like getting high tenured positions in good universities, because editor-in-chiefs of like major medical journals like JAMA or the New England Journal of Medicine, it's because they get the priority for funding. They are more likely to be able to publish, and so they are less likely to perish compared to these historically marginalized groups.
So another example of the historical injustice of how scientific research was conducted in the past is the selective application of medical ethics. One of the most notorious examples of this was the Tuskegee trials. So in the Tuskegee trials, a cohort of black men who were infected with syphilis were enrolled in a trial commissioned by the US government that aimed to study the natural history of the disease. At the time of their enrollment, they were promised treatment for their disease, but were instead given placebo pills because in order for them to study the natural history of the disease, they would have to study these subjects from the time that they were infected until such time that they suffered long-term or late complications and even death. And at the end of this study, hundreds of participants died as a result of the complications of syphilis. So what this shows is that historically, science has treated members of minority groups as expendable test subjects while conferring greater protection to members of the dominant majority in terms of when they were subjected to clinical trials. It was more likely that white participants would be enrolled in trials that were deemed safer, and members of these minority groups would be enrolled or participate in trials that were more dangerous, and they would be informed perhaps that safety standards would be followed, i.e. in the Tuskegee trials they were promised treatment, but there would be no follow through with these promises, and it would ultimately lead to loss of life.
This is a historical injustice that should be addressed. So the second thing that I think an opening government team should discuss is to talk about like why this would be better for the field in general. And to answer the question, what type of output would be produced now that these marginalized groups are the ones who are being prioritized? So you need to talk about the gaps in research knowledge that we have and how those gaps have perpetuated inequality. So there have the most recent example I think of this is in the NFL, a lot of older, NFL players, they suffer long-term brain damage because of the intensity of the sport and the fact that, they always get hit. But specifically, Black NFL players have had a more difficult time getting state benefits because their dementia scores are more difficult to assess because we don't have enough data on the baseline cognitive ability of like this population in general. So the reason why we don't have that is because IQ tests, which were developed a very long time ago, like in the 1920s or the 1930s, were mostly developed by white people. So the tests themselves advantage white people who are able to understand the material being presented more than Black people. So the assumption of that then was that Black people were less intelligent than white people because when you gave them the same test, Black people would score lower, not because they were dumber, but because the tests weren't designed for them, right? So this is one example of how if you had a person of color heading a research about, the IQ or creating an IQ test that would be more applicable to a wider population, you wouldn't be seeing these problems that we're seeing now. So that's one. Number two is another problem with the way that research was conducted is that these groups tend to get excluded as population, as test subjects. So for a long time, women weren't included in drug tests. So like when you would conduct a drug trial, it would be mostly men. And then you would assume that the results of the trial would also apply to women, which we know is obviously not true because they have, different physiologies and all of that, right? So if you have women who would lead these programs, you can argue that it is more likely that they would get a sample size that is more representative, that essentially includes women. And you would prevent the historically harmful drugs that were allowed into the market that were specifically harmful for women. Like the most famous example is thalidomide, which was a drug that caused abnormalities in babies, in pregnant women. But since a lot of women were not included in the trial, they never found out that the drug was already on the market. So historically marginalized groups as the agenda setters allows them to fill in these gaps that have historically perpetuated their own oppression and exclusion from scientific research.
So that's a very meaty case already for opening government, right? I can't imagine, like, if I had to go against you, basically, I'd be scared if I was closing. So help me out. If I was in closing government, what would I have to run in order to at least have a shot of beating the case that you just presented?
Okay, interesting. I think for the first one is to talk about like the importance of lived experiences in science. So this is an argument that I think can be run on opening as well to preempt a possible OO argument that we'll probably talk about later. Because they could say something like, well, you don't have to be Black to understand that Black people experience problems and all of that. But what I would say is that if a person of color is the one leading an investigation and the research is geared towards benefiting their particular demographic, it is more likely that they are going to get the level of support and participation, not just from the people funding them, but from the people that they are creating the research for. Because you can talk about how the historic disparity between the Blacks and the whites, for example, or men and women in multiple levels of society have sort of engendered this distrust between the two competing dominant majority and the oppressed minority, which means that your ability to get people to participate in the research that you are conducting is influenced by whether or not you trust that the person conducting the research is doing something in your best interest or not. And this is the reason why a lot of research tends tends to have high attrition rates, which is subjects dropping out or refusing to participate because they do not trust the person conducting the research. For example, if you have a research on the effects on, for example, whether particular levels of testosterone advantage trans athletes, right? If it's a straight male who is conducting the research, right, you're probably not going to trust that that person is doing it in your best interest compared to if it's an actual trans man or trans woman conducting the research for the same reason, even if they basically give you a similar rationale for conducting the research. And I think that's what's important. The reason why, for example, a lot of Black people in the time of COVID have distrusted the coronavirus vaccine is because they felt completely left out of the process. That even the people who were conducting the research weren't doing it for them. They were doing it for money, or they were doing it to perpetuate, whatever interest the dominant white people had. So just this representation in and of itself, even if the research itself doesn't produce anything good, will make it more likely that people will support and participate. And if they do that, then you will be able to get to a conclusion that will add to the pool of knowledge that you want to contribute to. So I think that's what one of the things I would extend on in this debate. Yeah.
So I guess we can move on to opposition. To this, I would ask, what would be a good reframing of this motion for opposition? Because I doubt that opposition, or like maybe it would happen, but I doubt that it'd be strategic for opposition to say, no, people of color were never denied opportunities.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. So what would be a better reframe for opposition for you?
Okay. I feel like the most strategic reframe for op in this debate is to, instead of asking the question of whose research should be funded, we should ask what research should be funded, right? Because if I were OO, I would say that the problem with OG's entire case is that it assumes that once you deputize, basically fund these historically marginalized individuals, that the research that they would produce is going to automatically be beneficial for the marginalized groups that they represent. When in fact, obviously these are individual researchers with their own interests, and obviously not, for example, not all LGBT researchers would research into LGBT issues, right? Because people's identities are not only defined by their race or their sexuality. They have different interests. So it's a problem-solution mismatch, essentially. In OP, I would say, if the problem is not enough research is being done for certain marginalized groups' interests, then you should prioritize funding the research that, regardless of who is conducting it, that prioritizes the interests of these people. For example, I just found out earlier when I was researching about this motion that there's a significant body of knowledge about trans athletes and their hormonal levels that have been done by very competent straight female, cis female, and cis male researchers. They aren't part of that historically marginalized group, but a lot of their research has been used in legislation to forward, for example, more inclusivity for these groups of people. So you don't want to demonize these basically the cis/white demographic, because you are going to need their help. You are going to need their expertise in order to do this research.
Why does their help matter though? Because this admittedly is a frame that talks about making alliances, but what is it about this research in particular that makes their help so useful? A
lot of these research topics are very niche, so disproportionately prioritize people of color in research or these marginalized groups. You're further narrowing the number of people who could potentially contribute to this pool of knowledge, and hope that one of the people's research that you fund, or one of the researchers that you fund, will eventually contribute to the pool of knowledge that you so desire for them to do. That's the way I would reframe it on op.
So now I guess we can go to the arguments, and I know probably that the arguments are going to either attack a lot of the arguments that government already brought up, or preempt things that will be extended on by government. So what were the key argumentations that you thought of for opposition? Because honestly, I'm a bit biased for this motion. I'm leaning more towards government, and I'm having a hard time thinking of what to run if I were on op.
Yeah, I agree. I also kind of lean gov in this motion. But the first thing I think that op needs to do is to dispel, as I mentioned earlier, the assumption that researchers from marginalized minority groups will always do research that benefits their marginalized minority. So that's not true, right? And the problem with prioritizing funding their research is twofold. The first one is that it creates sort of an undue pressure that if I am one of the few women of color or trans scientists out there, that I have to create research for these specific issues.
So this argument is basically saying that they'll feel pressured to research, in other words, something like black issues because they feel like they were only chosen because they themselves were black. But what makes this kind of undue pressure so harmful, especially for these particular scientists?
It basically forces them to change their career trajectory in order to fit into this mold. So essentially what you're doing is like you're applying something similar to the model minority pressure on these people by saying that, look, you're already being prioritized for funding. You might as well do something that helps your minority group, because no one else is going to do that. And if you don't do it, there's something like you're not being a good scientist who is a member of the minority. And I think that's very harmful, because ultimately the research that is best, or the best research output, aren't produced by people who feel pressured to create them, but are best produced by people who are actually interested and who have spent a significant amount of time studying these topics. And we're talking about scientific research that could influence policy, scientific research that could that could influence like the way that we perceive different things, right? So you want the best quality research.
So on one level, you can probably argue that just the mere fact that you have more people who can research this already kind of increases the likelihood of getting that high quality research that you need. What else could one talk about in this regard or with this line of thinking?
You would again have to talk about a lot of counter examples. For example, it would be preferable to have like these different marginalized groups and members of the dominant majority collaborate to produce this output, versus basically saying that if you're a member of the dominant majority, like you can't, like you will always be, you'll always be the second option, even if you have the better idea, the better methodology, and all of these things, because research has a lot of consequences, and it's not something that you can leave to chances like this. So that's the first one. I think the second thing, therefore, that stems from this is the whole concept of the glass cliff, which I know is more applicable to feminist debates specifically, but I think it also applies to this debate. So what happens if the research that you produce as a researcher from a minority that was prioritized in funding doesn't really yield anything, or fails to, for example, produce results in the desired timeline, or the process of conducting the research becomes questionable, similar to the research about autism, for example, like the link with vaccine and autism, which had a lot of problems even after it was published, then you become a target, right? So this is the nuance to this specific debate, is that oftentimes like the failure of individual researchers of color impact to the way that people perceive their marginalized group. For every research that doesn't yield anything, there is somebody to blame, right? And it may not be their fault, but they'll get blamed anyway, because people will say, hey, you were the one who was given the money. It could have gone to this other person, but you got it because you were a girl, or you got it because you were black, or you got it because you were LGBT.
For those who don't know, the glass cliff is sort of the counterpart to a glass ceiling. Because once a woman or anyone from a minority group breaks a glass ceiling, they are now faced with a glass cliff, which means that in instances where they do fail, it's not just their failure, but ends up becoming sort of seen as the failure of the entire movement or the entire group or the entire minority. So once people break ceilings, they now have to face this sort of cliff.
And I think that's not the kind of discourse that you want, right? Because the kind of interactions that you want to have, as you said, is collaborative. Like China and other countries in the world in this pandemic sharing everything they know about COVID to the rest of the world, so everyone could do work on a vaccine together. And in fact, China was getting a lot of flack for not releasing all of its information as soon as possible, right? So it's all about collaboration. It sounds like science is just an inherently collaborative endeavor.
Yes. Like this sort of disaggregated way of doing it that pits groups against each other essentially is not the way that you want scientific research to be conducted, and it can be very counterproductive. So yeah, that's what I thought of for like as a reframe/argument.
I was actually wondering, is there like a philosophy type of angle here about what the principle of science even is? Like, should it be more political? Is it more meritocratic? Stuff like that.
Yeah, I actually think that that's another very good angle that you can talk about. So remember that at the very start of our discussion, when you were asking how is research funded, I talked about feasibility, cost, and potential impact. So all of these are objectively measurable things, and they are also free from any politics because they are objectively measurable. There is no partisan anything here, right? Because science is empirical. If you add something as subjective as like them like using people's race or people's people's sexuality or people's biological sex as a reason for dictating funding, then that basically assumes that there is an objective link between these other factors and good quality research, which there really isn't, right? And it ties into, like, I guess the conclusion of the previous discussion on the glass cliff is that, yeah, science needs to be empirical. It shouldn't serve a particular end aside from getting towards the truth. So if the policy that you do reduces the likelihood of you getting to the truth, then it isn't good for science, and it's not something that you should do, right? So this is a principle discussion, I think, that you can sort of argue as like a priori, I guess, to a lot of the more I guess pragmatic things that I discussed earlier. It essentially frames the quote unquote impacts of the op case under this principle of science needs to get to the truth, and if your policy hinders that, then it's a bad policy for science. So yeah, I think it's a good idea. I guess liberal bias does sort of lay into defending this motion, but I think like op does seem a bit more technical than gov, because a lot of the matter does favor gov. But I think it's not, these arguments aren't really that inaccessible. I guess there might be a bit more effort to come up with them, but I'm confident that the debaters in the third dimension should be able to access these arguments. So yeah.
So
Thank
I guess
you.
the last question that we want to ask you is for those people, especially novices, who might find it difficult to debate or argue on science motions because, again, like what you said, some of the matter is not accessible. What advice would you give them?
Oh, well, I think the way, well, obviously, because I'm a doctor, I'm exposed to this type of information quite a lot. But I actually matter loaded, like, for this when I was preparing this motion on YouTube. There's actually a lot of very good YouTube videos that talk about the disparity in scientific knowledge and the historical reasons why. I think there were also a few good podcasts that had episodes that covered this. So the one about the IQ test, I think, was covered by Radio Lab in a very old series. I can't remember it right now, but it was definitely covered in a series by Radio Lab. So the material is out there. I think it is a little bit more difficult to find than, I guess, the normal, IR videos that people watch. But it's there, and I think if you subscribe to, I guess, a lot of the major Western newspapers like Wall Street Journal, New York Times, they sometimes cover this type of material. And there are also other, like, more, I guess, independent content creators like Philip DeFranco, for example. He was the one who covered the NFL dementia issue, and that's actually where I got that matter. So it is there. I think debaters just, I guess, they have to look for it a little bit more, but it is there. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much, RJ, for agreeing to be part of our episode and for answering our questions, as well as being a motion contributor for Debatable IV. So we really appreciate your, you took the time out of your day and your busy schedule to be part of the experience of the novices on our tournament, and I'm sure they're really appreciative of your contribution here as well. So that's it for this episode of Debatable. We'll see everyone in the next one. Bye.
Bye bye.